Jason thought he needed motivation. That was his biggest mistake. For years, he searched for it everywhere. YouTube videos, podcasts, books, quotes, anything that could give him that feeling, that push, that temporary fire. And it worked, for a while. He would watch something inspiring, feel energized, promise himself, "This time will be different." And for a few days, it was. He woke up early, focused more, worked harder, felt in control. But then, something always happened. That feeling faded, the energy dropped, the discipline disappeared, and Jason went back to the same habits, the same routine, the same life, again and again. It became a cycle. Motivation, to action, to drop, to repeat. And every time he failed to stay consistent, he blamed himself. Why can't I stay focused? Why do I lose discipline? What's wrong with me? He thought the problem was willpower, that he wasn't strong enough, that he needed more motivation, more discipline, more pressure. But the truth was something else, something deeper. Jason didn't have a motivation problem. He had an identity problem. An identity is what controls everything. Because people don't act based on what they want. They act based on who they believe they are. Jason believed he was inconsistent, so he acted inconsistently. He believed he lacked discipline, so he avoided discipline. He believed he wasn't that type of person, so he never became that person. And that belief was controlling his life, not consciously, but subconsciously, because identity works quietly, in the background, influencing every decision, every action, every habit. Jason didn't notice it at first, because it felt normal. It felt like reality. But it wasn't. It was programming. Years of patterns, repetition, experiences, all shaping how he saw himself. Jason started paying attention, not to what he was doing, but to why he was doing it. And patterns began to appear. Every time he tried something new, a voice appeared. "This isn't you. You won't stick to this. You've tried before." That voice felt real, convincing, like truth. But it wasn't truth. It was identity, old identity, trying to keep him the same. Because your mind doesn't like change. It prefers familiarity, even if that familiarity is limiting. Jason realized something powerful. He wasn't failing because he lacked discipline. He was failing because he was trying to act like someone he didn't believe he was. And that creates conflict, because actions and identity must align. If they don't, you lose consistency. Every time. Jason saw it clearly now. He was trying to build habits on top of an identity that didn't support them. And that's why nothing lasted, because behavior without identity doesn't stick. Jason asked himself a question, a different one. Not "what should I do?" but "who do I need to become?" That question changed everything, because now the focus shifted from actions to identity, and identity is the foundation. If you change your identity, your behavior follows, naturally, without forcing, without relying on motivation. Jason understood something deeper. Motivation is temporary. Identity is permanent. Motivation pushes you for a moment. Identity drives you every day. Motivation requires effort. Identity feels natural. Jason had been chasing the wrong thing all this time. He didn't need more motivation. He needed a new identity, a new version of himself. Someone who naturally does the things he struggles with now. Someone who doesn't need to force discipline, because discipline is part of who they are.
someone who doesn't rely on motivation because action is automatic. Jason didn't know exactly how to do it yet, but he knew one thing. He couldn't continue like this, not repeating the same cycle, not chasing temporary feelings, not staying stuck. Something had to change, not externally, internally, at the identity level, because real change starts there, and that realization was the beginning of everything.
Jason couldn't stop thinking about it. Identity. That word stayed in his mind, not like a concept, but like a realization, a missing piece, something that explained everything. For years, he had been focused on actions, what to do, how to do it, when to do it. Wake up early, work harder, be disciplined. Simple advice, clear instructions, but none of it lasted. And now he knew why. Because he was trying to change his behavior without changing who he believed he was. And that never works. Jason started observing himself closely, honestly, without judgment, just awareness. And what he saw was uncomfortable. Every time he tried to be productive, he felt resistance, not physical, mental. A quiet voice saying, "This isn't you. You're not consistent. You don't stick to things." And that voice wasn't random. It was familiar, because it had been there for years, reinforced by past failures, repeated experiences, moments where he started something and didn't finish. Those moments created a belief, a label. I'm not disciplined. And once a label becomes part of your identity, you act according to it, even when you try not to. Jason realized something powerful. He wasn't lazy. He was acting like someone who believed they were lazy. And that's different, because behavior can change quickly, but identity takes time. Jason also noticed something else. Whenever he skipped work, procrastinated, avoided effort, he didn't just feel lazy, he felt normal, because it matched his identity. But when he tried to be disciplined, it felt uncomfortable, because it didn't match. That's how powerful identity is. It controls your comfort zone, what feels natural, what feels wrong. Jason realized something deeper. If he wanted to change his life, he couldn't just change his actions. He had to change what felt normal. And that means changing identity. But that raised a question. How? How do you change something so deep, so ingrained, so automatic? Jason didn't have a clear answer yet, but he had clarity. And clarity is the first step. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep trying the same approach, chasing motivation, forcing discipline, relying on temporary energy, because it didn't work, and it never would, not long term. Jason started thinking differently. Instead of asking, "What should I do today?" he asked, "What would the person I want to become do?" That question felt different because it wasn't about effort. It was about identity. It forced him to think beyond his current self, beyond his habits, beyond his limitations. Jason imagined a version of himself, someone disciplined, focused, consistent, not perfect, but aligned. And he asked, what would that person do right now? And for the first time, the answer felt clear. Not easy, but clear. Because when you think from identity, decisions become simpler. You don't debate, you don't overthink. You choose based on alignment. Jason tried it in small moments, simple decisions. Instead of acting based on habit, he acted based on identity. And something interesting happened. It felt uncomfortable, but also right. Because even though it wasn't familiar, it aligned with where he wanted to go.
Jason understood something important. Change doesn't feel natural at first, because it's new, because it's different, because it doesn't match your current identity. But if you repeat it enough, it becomes familiar, and familiarity creates identity. Jason had been repeating the wrong patterns for years. Now he had to repeat the right ones, even if they felt uncomfortable, even if they felt unnatural, even if they required effort. Because repetition is how identity is built, not through thoughts, not through motivation, but through consistent action. Jason didn't feel confident yet. He didn't fully believe it, but he started acting differently. And that was enough. Because identity doesn't change instantly. It changes gradually, through evidence, through proof, through repetition. Jason was at the beginning of that process, the uncomfortable stage, where everything feels forced, but necessary. And that's where most people quit, because they expect change to feel easy. But it doesn't, not at the start. Jason didn't quit, because now he understood. And understanding changes everything.
Jason didn't wake up motivated. He didn't suddenly feel disciplined. He didn't feel like a new person. But he made a decision, a quiet one, a simple one. I'm going to act like the person I want to become. Not perfectly, not all at once, but in small moments. Because now he understood something most people miss. Big change doesn't start big. It starts small, very small. Jason didn't try to fix his whole life. He didn't set extreme goals. He didn't force himself into a new routine overnight. Because he knew that approach didn't work. He had tried it before, failed, repeated the cycle. This time, he did something different. He focused on identity. And identity is built through evidence, not words, not thoughts, but actions. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you are becoming. Jason understood that, so he started voting differently. Not with big moves, but with small ones. The next morning, his alarm went off, and immediately the old pattern appeared. Snooze it. Just 5 more minutes. You're tired. That voice felt familiar, comfortable, automatic. But this time, Jason paused, not reacting instantly, not following the habit. He asked himself a question. What would the disciplined version of me do? The answer was obvious. He would get up. No debate, no delay, just action. Jason didn't feel like doing it, not even close, but he did it anyway. Slowly, uncomfortably, but intentionally. And that moment was important, not because it was big, but because it was different. Because for the first time, he acted against his old identity, and that creates friction. But friction is where change happens. Jason stood up, not feeling proud, not feeling powerful, just aware. Aware that he made a different choice, and that choice was a vote for a new identity. He didn't celebrate, didn't overthink it, he just moved on. Because consistency is more important than intensity. Jason continued his day, small decisions, simple actions. Instead of procrastinating, he started, even if it was just for a few minutes. Instead of avoiding effort, he leaned into it, even if it felt uncomfortable. Instead of choosing easy, he chose aligned. And each time he did that, something changed, not dramatically, but subtly. Because identity doesn't shift overnight. It shifts through repetition, through proof, through consistent action. Jason didn't feel different yet, but he was acting differently. And that's where it starts. Because behavior creates evidence, and evidence builds belief. Jason also noticed something important. The more he acted differently, the less he relied on motivation. Because motivation wasn't needed. He wasn't waiting to feel ready. He was acting first, and feelings followed.
That's the opposite of what he used to do. Before, he waited to feel motivated, then acted. Now he acted, and motivation appeared later. That shift changed everything, because now he was in control. Not his feelings, not his mood, not his energy, but his decisions. And decisions define identity. Jason had moments where it felt easy, moments where things flowed, but he also had moments where it felt hard, where the old habits pulled him back, where the voice said, "This isn't you. You'll go back. You always do." That voice didn't disappear. It was still there, but it was weaker, because now Jason had evidence, small wins, proof that he could act differently, and that proof created confidence. Not loud confidence, not fake confidence, but quiet belief, the kind that builds over time. Jason understood something deeper. Confidence doesn't come first, action does, and confidence is built through repeated action. Jason kept going, day by day, decision by decision. He didn't try to be perfect. He didn't try to eliminate mistakes. He focused on consistency, because consistency builds identity, and identity shapes behavior. Jason also changed how he saw failure. Before, one mistake meant everything was ruined. I missed today, so I failed. I didn't follow the plan, so it's over. That mindset kept him stuck because it created all or nothing thinking. Now he saw it differently. One mistake didn't define him. One action didn't break his identity, because identity is built over time, not in a single moment. Jason had a bad day. He skipped something, avoided effort, fell back into an old habit, and the old voice appeared again. See, nothing changed. But this time he didn't believe it, because he had evidence, proof that he could act differently. So instead of quitting, he reset and continued, because progress is not about perfection, it's about persistence. Jason kept showing up, even when it was hard, even when it felt unnatural, even when he didn't feel like it, because now he understood. Every action matters, every decision counts, every moment is a vote. And over time, those votes add up. They create a pattern. That pattern becomes behavior, and behavior becomes identity. Jason wasn't trying to become someone overnight. He was becoming someone one decision at a time, and that process was real. But the biggest shift was internal. He no longer saw himself the same way, not fully, not completely, but differently. He started questioning his old labels. Maybe I'm not lazy. Maybe I can be consistent. Maybe I can change. Those thoughts were new, unfamiliar, but powerful, because identity begins with belief, and belief is shaped by evidence. Jason was building that evidence step by step, and that was enough, because real transformation is slow but permanent, and Jason was on that path, not perfectly, but consistently, and that consistency would change everything.
Jason didn't notice the change at first, because it wasn't loud. There was no moment where everything suddenly felt different, no instant transformation, no dramatic shift. But something was happening, quietly, subtly, and consistently. His actions were changing, and slowly those actions started reflecting who he was becoming. Jason was no longer reacting the same way. He wasn't procrastinating as much. He wasn't avoiding effort as often. He wasn't giving in to distractions immediately. And that created something new, momentum. Not explosive, not overwhelming, but steady. And steady momentum is what most people lack, because most people rely on motivation, and motivation is inconsistent. Jason wasn't relying on motivation anymore. He was relying on identity, and identity creates consistency. Jason started noticing small wins,
Simple things, but meaningful. Waking up without hitting snooze, starting work without delay, finishing tasks he would normally avoid. Each of those actions felt small, but they added up, because every action reinforced his new identity, and repetition turns actions into habits. Jason didn't feel perfect. He still had resistance, still had moments of doubt, still felt uncomfortable at times. But now he moved through it instead of stopping, and that difference is everything. Jason also noticed something interesting. The things that used to feel hard started feeling normal. Not easy, but expected, because his standards were changing, and standards shape behavior. Before, doing nothing felt normal. Now, doing something felt normal. Before, avoiding effort felt natural. Now, effort felt necessary. That shift is identity. Jason was no longer forcing himself. He was aligning himself. And alignment reduces resistance. But change doesn't happen in isolation. When you change, people notice. Not always immediately, but eventually. And Jason started seeing that too. People reacted differently, subtly, but noticeably. Some were surprised. You've been working a lot lately. You're more focused now. You've changed. That word again, changed. Before, it made Jason uncomfortable. Now, it didn't, because he knew it was true. He had changed. Not completely, but meaningfully. And that change was intentional. Jason didn't explain much, didn't justify his behavior. He simply said, "I'm working on myself." And that was enough, because clarity doesn't need long explanations. Jason also noticed something else. Some people didn't like the change. Not openly, not aggressively, but subtly. They expected the old version of him, the one who was always available, always flexible, always adjusting. But Jason wasn't that person anymore, and that created tension. Not dramatic, but real. Some conversations felt different. Some interactions felt off. Some people seemed distant. And that's normal, because when you change, your environment reacts. Not because people are against you, but because your change affects their expectations. Jason understood that, so he didn't take it personally. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't go back. He stayed consistent. Because consistency builds credibility, and credibility creates respect. Jason also noticed something powerful. The more consistent he became, the less he needed to prove anything, because his actions spoke. He didn't need to say he was disciplined, he showed it. He didn't need to explain his focus, he demonstrated it. And that created something new: confidence. Not loud confidence, not attention-seeking, but quiet certainty. The kind that comes from evidence, the kind that comes from doing. Jason trusted himself more, not blindly, but based on experience. He had seen himself act differently, repeatedly, and that created belief, real belief, not based on words, but on proof. Jason also stopped overthinking. Before, every decision felt heavy. What if this is wrong? What if I fail? What if I can't keep this up? Now, he acted, not recklessly, but confidently, because he knew action creates clarity, and clarity reduces doubt. Jason didn't wait to feel ready. He moved, and that movement created momentum. Momentum made things easier, not effortless, but smoother, because once you're in motion, it's easier to stay in motion. Jason was building that flow, step by step, day by day, and that consistency was changing everything. But the biggest shift was internal. He no longer saw himself the same way. He wasn't the person who tries. He was becoming the person who does. That difference is identity. Because trying is temporary, doing is permanent. Jason wasn't trying to be disciplined, he was becoming disciplined. And becoming is stronger than trying, because becoming is identity, and identity is who you are. Jason wasn't perfect. He still had bad days, still had moments of resistance, still struggled sometimes. But those moments didn't define him anymore, because identity is not built on perfection. It's built on consistency. Jason was consistent, and that consistency was shaping his life. But the journey wasn't over, because the next phase was deeper. Not just acting differently, but believing it fully. And that belief would change everything.
Jason didn't just act differently anymore. He started seeing himself differently, and that changed everything. Because behavior is surface, identity is deeper, but self-image, that's the core. The way you see yourself controls the way you live. Jason had spent years seeing himself in a certain way, inconsistent, unfocused, someone who starts but doesn't finish. Those weren't just thoughts, they were beliefs, and beliefs shape reality. Because you don't act based on what's true, you act based on what you believe is true. Jason believed he wasn't disciplined, so even when he tried, he failed to stay consistent. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't believe he could. That belief created limits, invisible ones, but powerful. Jason started questioning those beliefs, not emotionally, but logically. He asked himself something simple. Is this actually true, or is this just what I've repeated for years? That question created space, because once you question a belief, it loses power. Jason looked at his recent actions. He had been waking up on time, working consistently, following through. Small things, but real. And those actions didn't match his old identity. They contradicted it, which meant his old beliefs weren't entirely true. They were outdated, based on past behavior, not current reality. And that realization was powerful, because it gave him permission to change how he saw himself. Jason didn't suddenly believe he was perfect. He didn't jump to extremes, but he started adjusting his self-image. From "I'm not disciplined" to "I'm becoming disciplined." That small shift made a huge difference, because now his identity wasn't fixed, it was evolving, and evolving identities create growth. Jason also understood something deeper. Your brain looks for evidence to support your identity. If you believe you're lazy, your brain finds proof. If you believe you're disciplined, your brain looks for proof. Jason started feeding his brain new evidence, intentionally. Every time he completed a task, he acknowledged it, not in an exaggerated way, but consciously. Every time he followed through, he noticed it, because awareness reinforces identity. Jason wasn't just acting differently, he was recognizing it, and recognition builds belief. Jason also stopped using negative language. Before, he would say things like, "I'm bad at this," "I can't stay consistent," "I always mess up." Those statements felt normal, but they were reinforcing his old identity. Now, he changed how he spoke. Not fake positivity, but intentional language. "I'm improving. I'm getting better. I'm learning discipline." And that shift changed his mindset, because words shape perception, and perception shapes identity. Jason also noticed something interesting. The more he changed his self-image, the less resistance he felt. Because resistance comes from conflict. When your actions and identity don't match, you feel tension. But when they align, you feel flow. Jason was starting to feel that flow. Not always, but more often. And that made things easier, not effortless, but smoother. Because he wasn't fighting himself anymore. He was aligning with himself. Jason also became more patient. Before, he wanted fast results, immediate change, instant transformation. Now, he understood something important. Identity change is slow because it's deep. It's not about what you do once, it's about what you do consistently over time. Jason stopped chasing quick wins. He focused on daily actions, small improvements, consistent effort. Because consistency creates identity, and identity creates results. Jason also stopped comparing himself. Before, he looked at others, measured his progress, doubted himself. Now, he focused on his own path. Because identity is personal. It's not about being better than others. It's about becoming better than who you were. Jason compared himself to his past, and that made growth visible. Because he could see the difference, feel the change, recognize the progress. And that recognition built confidence, real confidence, not based on external validation, but internal evidence. Jason also realized something deeper. You don't need to prove your identity to others. You need to prove it to yourself. Because once you believe it, everything else follows. Jason didn't talk about his change much. He didn't announce it. He didn't try to show it. He just lived it. Quietly, consistently. And that consistency was enough. Because real identity doesn't need validation. It shows itself through behavior, through presence, through decisions. Jason had reached a new level. Not externally, but internally. He believed differently, saw himself differently, thought differently. And that internal shift was shaping everything. But the journey wasn't over, because the next phase was about stability, making this new identity permanent, not temporary, not fragile, but unshakable. And that would require something deeper. Consistency at a higher level. Jason wasn't trying to change anymore. He was trying to stabilize, because change is easy to start, but hard to maintain. And what most people don't understand is this: starting a new identity is exciting, but protecting it requires discipline, real discipline. Jason had already taken the first steps. He was acting differently, thinking differently, seeing himself differently. But now, he had to make it permanent. Because without stability, everything falls apart. Jason had experienced that before. Moments of motivation, short bursts of consistency, temporary change, and then back to the old version. He wasn't going to repeat that cycle again, not this time, because now he understood the system. Identity is built through action, but identity is protected through discipline. And discipline is what most people avoid. Because discipline doesn't feel good. It doesn't give instant reward. It doesn't create excitement. It's repetitive, predictable, sometimes boring. But that's what makes it powerful. Jason realized something important. If he only acted when he felt like it, he would fall back. Because feelings are unstable. They change, they fluctuate, they disappear. But identity must remain consistent. Jason made a decision, a simple rule. I don't act based on how I feel. I act based on who I am becoming. That rule changed everything. Because now, his actions weren't controlled by mood. They were controlled by identity. One morning, Jason woke up, tired, low energy, no motivation. The old version of him would have stayed in bed, delayed everything, made excuses. But now, he paused, not reacting immediately. He asked himself, what does the disciplined version of me do right now? The answer was clear. He gets up. No debate, no negotiation. Jason didn't feel like doing it, but he did it anyway. And that moment strengthened his identity. Because discipline is not about feeling strong. It's about acting despite not feeling strong. Jason also created structure. Not extreme, not rigid, but consistent. He had a routine, a system, a flow. Not because he loved routines, but because routines remove decisions, and fewer decisions mean less mental resistance. Jason didn't wake up and ask, "What should I do today?" He already knew, because his system guided him, and systems create stability. Jason also removed unnecessary distractions, not completely, but intentionally. He understood something simple: environment influences behavior. If your environment supports distraction, you will be distracted. If your environment supports focus, you will be focused. Jason adjusted his environment: cleaner workspace, fewer interruptions, less noise, more clarity. And that made discipline easier, because now he wasn't fighting constant temptation. He was aligning his environment with his identity. Jason also learned something deeper. Consistency is not about being perfect, it's about returning quickly. He had bad days, moments where he slipped, skipped something, lost focus, felt off. But the difference was, he didn't stay there. He didn't spiral. He didn't go back to his old identity. He reset and continued. Because one mistake doesn't break identity, but quitting does. Jason stopped thinking in extremes: all or nothing, perfect or failure. Instead, he focused on progress, small steps, daily actions, consistent movement, and that mindset created stability. Jason also stopped relying on motivation completely. He didn't expect to feel inspired. He didn't wait for energy. He didn't depend on external input. Because he understood, motivation is optional, identity is essential. Jason was no longer asking, "Do I feel like doing this?" He was asking, "Is this who I am now?" And that question removed hesitation. Because identity-driven decisions are clear, direct, immediate. Jason also noticed something interesting. The more consistent he became, the easier things felt. Not because they were easier, but because they were familiar. And familiarity creates comfort. What once felt difficult now felt normal, because his identity had shifted. Jason had reached a point where discipline wasn't forced, it was expected. It was part of who he was. And that's the goal. Not to force discipline, but to become disciplined. Jason also developed something deeper: self-trust, the ability to rely on himself, to follow through, to stay consistent, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable. That trust is powerful, because when you trust yourself, you stop doubting your decisions, you stop questioning your direction, you move forward with clarity, with confidence, with control. Jason had built that through action, through consistency, through discipline. And that foundation made his identity stable, not temporary, not fragile, but strong, unshakable. Jason wasn't the same person anymore, not because he changed once, but because he stayed consistent. And consistency creates permanence. Jason had created a new identity, not through motivation, but through repetition. And that identity was now part of him. But the journey wasn't over, because the next phase was different. Not about building, not about stabilizing, but about living fully with this new identity. And that would change everything. Jason didn't notice the exact moment it happened. There was no single day where everything felt different, no sudden realization, no dramatic shift. But one thing became clear. Life felt lighter. Not easier, but lighter. Because for the first time, he wasn't fighting himself. That internal battle, the constant negotiation, the hesitation, the overthinking, it was fading. And when that disappears, everything changes. Jason's life didn't become perfect. He still had responsibilities, challenges, pressure. But the way he experienced those things was completely different. Because now he had control. Not over everything, but over himself. And that's what matters. Jason started noticing something subtle. His decisions became faster, cleaner, more direct. Before, even small choices felt heavy. What if I fail? What if this is wrong? What will people think? Now, those questions were gone. Or at least, they didn't slow him down anymore, because his identity was clear, and clarity removes hesitation. Jason didn't need to overthink. He already knew who he was, and when you know who you are, decisions become simple. Jason also stopped chasing outcomes. Before, everything was about results, success, validation, recognition. Now, it was different. He focused on process, daily actions, consistent effort, because he understood results are a byproduct, not the goal. The goal is identity, and when identity is strong, results follow naturally. Jason's lifestyle changed, not in a flashy way, not dramatically, but fundamentally. He woke up with direction, worked with focus, rested without guilt, and moved through his day with intention. There was no chaos, no constant distraction, no unnecessary noise, just clarity. And that clarity created peace. Jason also noticed something interesting. He didn't need motivation anymore, not because he was always energetic, but because he didn't rely on feelings. He relied on identity. And identity is stable. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't disappear. It stays. Jason acted even when he didn't feel like it. And over time, that became normal, natural, automatic. That's when he realized something powerful. Discipline is not something you do, it's something you become. Jason had become disciplined, not perfectly, but consistently. And that consistency changed his entire lifestyle. Jason also felt a new kind of confidence, not loud, not arrogant, not attention-seeking, but calm, quiet, grounded. The kind of confidence that doesn't need validation because it comes from within, from evidence, from proof, from experience. Jason trusted himself, his decisions, his direction, his process, and that trust removed doubt, because doubt exists when there's uncertainty. Jason wasn't uncertain anymore. Not completely, but enough. Enough to move forward without hesitation. Jason also became more selective, not just with his actions, but with his environment, his time, his energy. He didn't say yes to everything. He didn't engage in every conversation. He didn't give attention to everything, because he understood where you place your energy defines your life. Jason placed his energy intentionally on what mattered, on what aligned, on what moved him forward. And that made a difference, because focus creates results. Jason also stopped trying to impress people. Before, he cared about perception, about how others saw him. Now, he didn't, because he understood something simple. People will always have opinions, but those opinions don't define your life. Your actions do. Jason focused on his path, his growth, his direction, and that removed pressure, because he wasn't trying to be someone for others. He was being himself. And authenticity is powerful, because it's rare. Jason also noticed something deeper. He was no longer afraid of failure, not because failure disappeared, but because his identity was stable. Before, failure felt like proof he wasn't good enough. Now, failure was just feedback, a part of the process, not a reflection of who he was. And that mindset removed fear. Because when you're not afraid to fail, you act more, you try more,
you grow faster. Jason had that freedom, the freedom to act without overthinking, without fear controlling him. And that freedom is what most people want, but few achieve, because it requires identity shift, not motivation. Jason had gone through that shift, step by step, decision by decision, and now he was living it. Not perfectly, but consistently. Jason stood outside one evening, looking at the city, people rushing, lights moving, life happening. And for the first time, he didn't feel behind. He didn't feel lost. He didn't feel confused. He felt aligned with himself, with his direction, with his life. And that alignment is everything. Because when you are aligned, you don't need to chase. You don't need to force. You don't need to prove. You just move forward. Jason had reached that point. Not the end, but a new beginning. A life where identity drives everything. And that life is different. But the journey wasn't finished, because the final realization was still ahead. The truth that would define everything.
Jason didn't feel like he was trying anymore. That was the difference. Before, everything felt like effort, like pushing, like forcing himself to become someone else. But now, it felt natural, not easy, but aligned. And alignment changes everything. Because when your identity and actions match, there is no internal conflict, no hesitation, no constant negotiation, just clarity. Jason had reached a point where discipline wasn't something he thought about. It was something he did, automatically, like a habit, like a default setting. And that's what identity mastery looks like. Not perfection, not extreme performance, but consistency without resistance. Jason also noticed something deeper. His life was changing without him trying to change it. Opportunities felt different. Conversations felt different. Even the way people responded to him was different. Because identity doesn't just change you internally, it changes how the world interacts with you. Jason wasn't chasing opportunities anymore. He wasn't forcing connections. He wasn't trying to prove anything. But things were happening, naturally. Because when your identity shifts, your behavior shifts. Your behavior shifts, your results change. And your results create a new life. Jason had stopped focusing on outcomes, but outcomes were changing anyway. That's the paradox. The less you chase results, the more they come, because you're focused on identity, and identity drives everything. Jason also realized something powerful. You don't rise to your goals, you fall to your identity. That truth changed how he saw everything, because now goals didn't feel as important. They were still there, but they weren't the focus. The focus was identity. Because if your identity is strong, goals become inevitable. If your identity is weak, goals remain distant. Jason had spent years setting goals, wanting change, hoping for results. But without identity, nothing lasted. Now he understood. The goal is not the destination, the identity is. Because identity determines where you go. Jason also noticed something else. He became more patient, not because he wanted to, but because he understood. Real growth takes time. Identity takes time, and rushing it only creates frustration. Jason stopped expecting fast results, stopped chasing quick wins, stopped comparing his timeline, because he knew, as long as his identity was aligned, he was moving forward. And that was enough. Jason also stopped needing validation. Before, he wanted people to notice, to acknowledge his change, to see his growth. Now, he didn't, because his identity wasn't based on others. It was internal. And internal identity doesn't need external approval. Jason didn't care if people saw it, because he felt it, and feeling it was enough. Jason also understood something deeper. The version of you that you repeat becomes permanent. Not the version you think about, not the version you talk about, but the version you act as every day. Jason had repeated a new version of himself consistently, and now that version was becoming permanent. Not forced, not temporary, but real. Jason also noticed something subtle. He no longer questioned his direction. Before, he doubted everything, his decisions, his path, his progress. Now, he didn't. Because identity removes doubt. When you know who you are, you don't question every step. You move. Jason moved forward, with clarity, with confidence, with control. And that created something powerful. Momentum. Real momentum. Not based on motivation, but based on identity. And that kind of momentum is unstoppable. Jason had reached a level most people don't reach, not because it's impossible, but because it requires consistency, patience, awareness, and most people quit before they get there. Jason didn't quit because he understood, and understanding creates commitment. Jason also realized something important. This wasn't the end. There was no final version, no perfect identity, no finished state. Because identity is always evolving, always growing, always expanding. But the foundation was set, strong, stable, clear. Jason had built that foundation through repetition, through discipline, through alignment. And that foundation would support everything that comes next. Jason stood still one evening, looking around, not searching, not thinking, just observing. And for the first time, he felt something different. Not pride, not excitement, but certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need validation. The kind that comes from knowing you are no longer the same person. Jason had changed, not externally, but internally, at the identity level. And that change was permanent. But there was one final realization left, the one that defines everything. The truth that most people never understand. And once you see it, you can't go back. Jason didn't need more advice anymore. He didn't need another video, another book, another system, because now he understood something deeper, something most people spend their entire life avoiding, not because it's complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. Jason realized something simple but powerful. You are not stuck because of your circumstances. You are stuck because of your identity. That truth changed everything, because it removed every excuse, every blame, every external reason. Jason used to think life was holding him back, lack of motivation, lack of time, lack of discipline. But now he saw it clearly. It wasn't his environment. It wasn't his situation. It was his identity. Because your identity defines your actions define your results, and your results create your life. Jason had been living the result of an old identity and expecting a different outcome. That's why nothing changed, because nothing can change if identity stays the same. Jason looked at his past, all the moments he felt stuck, all the times he tried to improve, all the times he failed to stay consistent. And now it made sense. He wasn't failing, he was repeating the same identity over and over again.
Jason also realized something deeper. Change doesn't happen when you try harder. It happens when you become different. That shift is everything, because trying is temporary, becoming is permanent. Jason had spent years trying to be disciplined, trying to be focused, trying to change. But trying didn't last, because trying doesn't change identity. It only changes behavior, temporarily. Jason understood now. If you want different results, you don't need new actions. You need a new identity. Because identity is the root. Everything else is a result. Jason also saw something uncomfortable. Most people never change, not because they can't, but because they stay attached to who they are. Their labels, their past, their habits, their comfort zone. And that attachment keeps them stuck. Jason almost stayed there, almost accepted it, almost convinced himself, this is just who I am. But he didn't, because he questioned it. And questioning identity is the first step to changing it. Jason also realized something powerful. You don't become a new person overnight. You become a new person by acting like them daily. Not once, not sometimes, but consistently. Jason had done that, step by step, decision by decision. And now he was no longer the same person. Not because he wanted to be different, but because he had acted differently, repeatedly. Jason also understood something most people ignore. Your future is predictable, not based on your goals, but based on your identity. If your identity doesn't change, your future won't either, because you will keep making the same decisions, taking the same actions, creating the same results. Jason had changed that pattern, not through motivation, not through pressure, but through identity. And that made his future different, not guaranteed, but directed. Jason also noticed something deeper. He didn't feel stuck anymore, not because everything was perfect, but because he had control. Control over his decisions, control over his actions, control over his identity. And control creates freedom, real freedom, not external, but internal. Jason also stopped fearing failure because he understood something simple. Failure doesn't define identity. Quitting does. As long as he kept acting aligned, he was still becoming, still growing, still moving forward. And that mindset removed fear because he wasn't focused on outcomes, he was focused on identity. Jason also realized something else. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need to feel confident. You don't need to feel motivated. You just need to act. Because action creates identity, and identity creates everything else. Jason had waited for feelings before. Now he acted without them, and that made him different. Jason stood still, thinking, not confused, not lost, but clear, because everything made sense now. The struggles, the failures, the patterns, it all came back to one thing: identity. And once you understand that, you can't ignore it, because now you know the truth, and truth demands action. Jason had taken that action, and it changed his life, not instantly, not dramatically, but permanently. But there was one final realization left, the one that brings everything together, the one that defines everything, and once you see it, there's no going back.
Jason didn't feel like he reached the end, because there was no end, no final version, no perfect state. But something inside him was complete. Not his life, not his journey, but his understanding. He finally understood what most people never do. Change doesn't come from trying harder. It doesn't come from waiting for the right moment. It doesn't come from motivation. It comes from identity. And identity is a choice, not a fixed truth, not something you're born with, not something you're stuck with. a choice made daily, through actions, through decisions, through repetition. Jason used to believe he was a certain type of person, someone inconsistent, someone who lacked discipline, someone who couldn't stay focused. But now he saw the truth. That wasn't who he was. That was who he practiced being. And practice creates identity. Jason didn't magically become someone new. He practiced becoming someone new. Every day, through small actions, through consistent decisions, through aligned behavior. And over time, that practice became identity. Jason also realized something powerful. You don't find yourself, you create yourself. Because who you are is not something fixed, it's something built, shaped, defined by what you do repeatedly. Jason had built a new version of himself, not through thinking, not through planning, but through action, consistent action. And that action changed everything. Jason no longer needed to prove anything, not to others, not even to himself, because he had evidence, proof of who he was becoming, and that proof created certainty, real certainty, the kind that doesn't shake, the kind that doesn't depend on validation, the kind that stays even when things get hard. Jason also understood something deeper. Your identity determines your standards, and your standards determine your life. If you see yourself as someone who settles, you will accept less. If you see yourself as someone who avoids effort, you will avoid growth. If you see yourself as someone who quits, you will never finish. But if you see yourself as someone disciplined, you act disciplined. If you see yourself as someone focused, you act focused. If you see yourself as someone consistent, you act consistently. And those actions create your reality. Jason had changed his standards, not by forcing himself, but by changing his identity. And that shift defined everything. Jason also stopped asking, "What should I do?" because now he asked a better question, "Who am I becoming?" And that question guided everything, every decision, every action, every moment. Jason no longer needed motivation because identity replaced it. He no longer needed external pressure because internal clarity guided him. He no longer needed to chase change because he had become it. Jason stood still one evening, looking at the city again. The same environment, the same world, but everything felt different because he was different. Not on the outside, but on the inside. And internal change is what creates real transformation. Jason didn't feel overwhelmed anymore, didn't feel lost, didn't feel stuck. He felt in control, not of everything, but of himself. And that's enough, because when you control yourself, you control your direction. Jason also realized something final. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need the right timing. You don't need ideal conditions. You just need to decide who you are going to be and start acting like it. Because identity is not something you wait for. It's something you build, moment by moment, decision by decision. Jason had built that, and now he was living it. Not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency is what creates everything. Jason smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was clear. He finally understood. After all the confusion, all the struggle, all the change, the truth, the real one, the one that defines everything.